The scorching summer sun beat down on the small town of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878, as Rebecca Lawson's heart raced with fear. She had never thought that accepting an invitation to a harvest celebration would end with her fighting for her life, trapped in a burning barn with smoke filling her lungs and flames licking at the wooden beams around her. Rebecca had arrived in Willow Creek just 3 weeks prior, leaving behind the comforts of Philadelphia to take a position as the town's new schoolteacher. At 22, she had been eager for adventure and independence, determined to make her own way in the world after her father's passing left her with little more than a trunk of books and a teaching certificate. The West had seemed like a fresh start, a place where she could rebuild her life away from the pitying glances of family friends. The town had welcomed her warmly enough, though adjusting to the rough-hewn ways of the frontier had been challenging. Her small cabin adjacent to the schoolhouse was nothing like the brick townhouse she'd grown up in, and her delicate hands had quickly developed calluses from carrying water and chopping kindling. But she had been managing, taking pride in her self-sufficiency and the respect she'd earned from her pupils. That morning had dawned bright and clear, perfect for the Murphy family's barn raising and harvest celebration. Rebecca had dressed in her second-best dress, a cornflower blue cotton that brought out the deep blue of her eyes, and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat arrangement that would withstand the day's festivities. The entire town would be there, and though she was still considered something of an outsider, she was determined to integrate herself into the community. She'd been enjoying herself, sampling Mrs. Murphy's famous apple pie and watching the children play tag around the newly constructed barn when she noticed a group of rough-looking men arrive. They kept to themselves, drinking heavily from flasks concealed in their jacket pockets and eyeing the festivities with undisguised contempt. "Don't mind them," Ellen Murphy had whispered, following Rebecca's gaze. "That's the Delaney gang. They own the Silver Dollar Saloon in town, not the sort of men decent folk associate with, but my husband says it's better to have them here than cause offense by not inviting them." Rebecca had nodded and tried to put the men from her mind, but throughout the afternoon she'd felt the weight of their stares, particularly from Jeremiah Delaney, whose cold eyes seemed to follow her movements with predatory interest. As the celebration continued into the evening with fiddle music and dancing by lantern light, Rebecca had stepped away to catch her breath. The cool evening air was a relief after the press of bodies in the yard, and she'd wandered toward the new barn, admiring its sturdy construction. "Quite the structure, ain't it?" The voice had startled her, and she'd turned to find Jeremiah Delaney standing too close behind her, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Yes, indeed. The community has done remarkable work," she'd replied politely, taking a step back. "You're the new schoolmarm, ain't ya? The fancy Eastern girl." He'd moved closer again, backing her toward the barn door. "Bet they don't teach you much about real life in those fancy schools. Mr. Delaney, I should return to the celebration." She'd tried to step around him, but his arm had shot out, blocking her path. "We're just getting acquainted, schoolmarm. No need to rush off." What happened next remained a blur in Rebecca's memory, her attempt to flee, his grabbing her arm, her cry for help, and then being shoved into the darkened barn. She'd stumbled and fallen onto a pile of hay, and by the time she'd regained her footing, the barn door had slammed shut, the distinct sound of a lock sliding into place echoing in the cavernous space. "Mr. Delaney, this isn't amusing. Let me out this instant." She'd pounded on the door, but the music from the celebration had drowned out her cries. Minutes passed as she searched for another exit, climbing to the loft to look for a window large enough to climb through. It was there, in the loft, that she'd first smelled the smoke. At first she thought it might be from the celebration's bonfire, but the acrid scent grew stronger. When she peered over the edge of the loft, her blood ran cold. Flames were creeping up the wall near the door, spreading with alarming speed across the dry hay scattered on the floor. Had Delaney done this, set fire to the barn with her trapped inside, or was it an accident, a carelessly discarded cigar or match? It didn't matter now. The fire was growing, feeding on the fresh timber and hay, and the smoke was thickening by the second. That had been 10 minutes ago. Now, Rebecca huddled in the loft, a dampened handkerchief pressed to her face as she tried to breathe through the thickening smoke. The flames had spread rapidly, consuming the lower level of the barn and beginning to climb toward her refuge. The heat was intense, sweat pouring down her face and back as she frantically searched for an escape. There was a small window at the far end of the loft, but it was at least 20 feet above the ground, too far to jump without serious injury. The main doors were engulfed in flames, and the side door she'd discovered was jammed shut, refusing to budge no matter how desperately she threw her weight against it. "Help!" she screamed again, her voice growing hoarse. "Someone please help me." But the roar of the fire seemed to swallow her cries, and the celebration was too far away for anyone to notice the blaze yet. The smoke was becoming unbearable, burning her eyes and throat. Rebecca knew she couldn't last much longer. Desperation clawed at her chest along with the smoke. Was this how her life would end, so far from home, in a blazing barn in the Arizona Territory? The thought of her father's disappointment, of all her dreams dying with her, brought tears to her eyes. She had come west to build a new life, to make a difference in the lives of the children she taught. It couldn't end like this. As the flames reached the edge of the loft, Rebecca backed toward the small window, her only remaining hope. Perhaps someone would see the fire now, perhaps help would come. But as the heat intensified and the smoke thickened further, darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision. Her legs weakened, and she sank to her knees, the handkerchief slipping from her nerveless fingers. In the distance, as consciousness began to fade, she thought she heard shouting. Was it real or merely the desperate hope of her dying mind? The last thing Rebecca saw before darkness claimed her was the window exploding inward in a shower of glass, and the silhouette of a man against the night sky. Flynn McAllister had seen his share of horrors in his 30 years of life. As a former Union cavalry officer who'd fought at Shiloh and Gettysburg, he'd witnessed men torn apart by cannon fire and fields soaked red with blood. As a Texas Ranger for 5 years after the war, he'd tracked murderers across unforgiving terrain and faced down outlaws who killed for sport. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of the Murphys' new barn engulfed in flames, with the knowledge that someone was trapped inside. He'd arrived late to the celebration, having spent the day tracking a missing calf from his small ranch outside of town. The sun had already set by the time he'd cleaned up and ridden in, expecting nothing more than some good food, maybe a dance or two, and pleasant conversation with his neighbors. Instead, he'd arrived to find chaos. The barn was an inferno, flames shooting 30 feet into the night sky, and people were rushing about with buckets of water in a futile attempt to control the blaze. Through the confusion, Flynn had heard Ellen Murphy's hysterical cries. "Rebecca's in there. The schoolteacher is trapped in the barn." Those words had stopped his heart cold. Though he'd only met Rebecca Lawson briefly since her arrival in town, a polite exchange at the general store, a tip of his hat when passing her on his infrequent trips to town, there had been something about the poised, intelligent young woman with the determined chin and thoughtful eyes that had stayed with him. Without hesitation, Flynn had spurred his horse toward the burning structure, ignoring the shouts from the men trying to organize a rescue. There wasn't time for committees or careful planning, not if the schoolteacher was still alive in that inferno. As he approached the barn, the heat hit him like a physical blow. His horse, Samson, a steady gray stallion that had carried him through gunfights without flinching, balked at first, instinct telling the animal to flee the danger. But Flynn's firm hand and urgent voice convinced the loyal beast to continue. "We can't reach the doors, they're completely engulfed," shouted Sheriff Taylor, grabbing at Flynn's leg as he rode past. Flynn scanned the burning building, his experienced eyes seeking any possible entry point. The main doors were indeed lost to the flames, but the rear of the barn seemed less consumed. There was a chance slim, but a chance nonetheless. "I'm going in through the back," he called to the sheriff. "Get men ready with blankets and water." Without waiting for a response, Flynn urged Samson toward the rear of the barn. The smoke was thick and choking, but through watering eyes he spotted a small door, partially hidden by stacked lumber. It was scorched but not yet engulfed. That was his way in. Pulling his bandana over his mouth and nose, Flynn dismounted, gave Samson a reassuring pat, and approached the door. The metal handle seared his palm, but he barely registered the pain as he threw his weight against the wooden barrier. It refused to budge at first, locked or jammed from the inside. Drawing his revolver, Flynn shot the lock, the report of the weapon lost in the roar of the flames. The door swung inward, releasing a billowing cloud of black smoke that sent him staggering back, coughing violently. The interior was a vision of hell flames climbing the walls, rafters groaning as they weakened, and the air itself seeming to burn with every breath. "Miss Lawson," Flynn shouted, his voice hoarse. "Rebecca, where are you?" Straining to hear over the crackle and roar of the fire, Flynn thought he detected a faint sound from above the loft. He spotted the ladder, already partially consumed by flames, but it was his only way up. Steeling himself, he began to climb, the rungs burning through his leather gloves. Halfway up, a rung gave way beneath his foot, nearly sending him plummeting to the floor below, but he managed to catch himself, arms straining as he pulled his body upward. The loft was a smoky hell, visibility reduced to mere inches. Flynn crawled on his belly where the air was marginally better, calling Rebecca's name between racking coughs. His lungs felt as though they were filled with broken glass, and the heat was blistering his skin through his clothing. "Rebecca," he called again, desperation edging his voice. And then, through the smoke, he saw her, a crumpled form near a small window, unmoving. Flynn's heart lurched. Had he come too late? Crawling to her side, he pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak and thready, but present. Relief surged through him, but it was short-lived. The loft groaned ominously beneath them, and a section of the roof collapsed with a shower of sparks and burning debris. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the entire structure came down around them. The ladder was no longer an option. It had been consumed by the flames. The only way out was the small window beside them. Using the butt of his revolver, Flynn smashed the remaining glass from the frame. Fresh air rushed in, temporarily clearing the smoke around them. Looking out, he saw a drop of about 20 feet to hard-packed earth, not survivable for an unconscious woman. A thunderous crack resounded through the barn as another beam gave way. Time had run out. Flynn gathered Rebecca in his arms, her slender form surprisingly light against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, face deathly pale beneath the soot staining her skin. "Hold on, Miss Lawson," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear. "This ain't going to be pleasant." Positioning himself at the window, Flynn whistled sharply, praying that Samson hadn't bolted from the fire. To his immense relief, the faithful horse appeared below, eyes rolling with fear but standing firm. "Steady, boy," Flynn called down. "We're coming to you." With one arm securely around Rebecca's waist, Flynn climbed onto the windowsill. The drop was still dangerous, but Samson's broad back would give them a fighting chance. As the loft floor began to collapse behind them, Flynn leaped, twisting in midair to ensure his body would take the impact rather than Rebecca's. They landed hard on Samson's back, the impact driving the breath from Flynn's lungs. The horse staggered but remained standing as Flynn gripped Rebecca tightly with one arm and the saddle horn with the other, somehow maintaining their precarious perch. "Go, Samson, move," he gasped, and the horse needed no further urging. With Rebecca cradled across his lap, Flynn guided Samson away from the blazing barn, the stallion's powerful muscles bunching beneath them as he galloped toward safety. They emerged from the smoke like specters, Flynn hunched protectively over Rebecca's limp form, his clothing singed and his face blackened with soot. A cheer went up from the gathered crowd as they appeared, but Flynn paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on the unconscious woman in his arms. Reining Samson to a halt a safe distance from the fire, Flynn slid carefully to the ground, cradling Rebecca against his chest. "I need help here," he shouted, his voice raw from smoke. She's not breathing right. Doc Henderson pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in one gnarled hand. "Bring her to my wagon," he ordered, all business despite the chaos surrounding them. "Smoke inhalation by the looks of it. We need to get her breathing clear." Flynn carried Rebecca to the doctor's wagon, laying her gently on the blanket-covered bed in the back. Her face was ghostly in the firelight, lips tinged blue, and her breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. "Is she going to be all right?" Flynn asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice as the doctor listened to Rebecca's chest with his stethoscope. Doc Henderson's weathered face was grave. "Can't say for certain. Smoke can do terrible damage to the lungs. We need to get her to my office immediately." He looked up at Flynn, taking in his burned hands and the singed hair at his temples. "You should come too. Those burns need tending." Flynn shook his head. "I'm fine. Take care of Miss Lawson." He stepped back from the wagon, watching as the doctor called for his assistant to drive them to town, but something held him there, unable to turn away. As the wagon began to move, Rebecca's eyes fluttered open briefly. Her gaze, confused and pain-filled, met Flynn's for a heartbeat before closing again. In that moment, something shifted in Flynn McAllister's chest, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. "You're a damn fool, McAllister," Sheriff Taylor said, coming to stand beside him as the wagon disappeared down the road toward town. "Riding into a burning building like that could have gotten yourself killed." Flynn didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the point where the wagon had disappeared into the darkness. Finally, he turned to the sheriff, his expression hardening. "Who was responsible for this?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "Can't say for certain yet, but Ellen Murphy says Miss Lawson was last seen near Jeremiah Delaney, and Delaney and his boys cleared out mighty quick once the fire was spotted." Flynn's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. "Delaney," he growled, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Now hold on," the sheriff said quickly, recognizing the look in Flynn's eyes. "We don't know anything for sure yet. Could have been an accident. Let me handle this officially, Flynn. The last thing we need is you charging off half-cocked after Delaney." Flynn wanted nothing more than to mount Samson and ride after the Delaney gang immediately, but the sheriff was right. Without proof, without Rebecca's account of what happened, he had nothing but suspicion to go on. And more importantly, he needed to know if she would recover. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly. "But I want to be there when you question her if she's able." The sheriff nodded, relieved. "Fair enough. Now go get those burns looked at before they fester. Miss Lawson won't thank you for saving her life if you die of infection afterward." Flynn looked down at his hands, noticing the blistered skin for the first time. The adrenaline was wearing off, and pain was beginning to register. Still, it was nothing compared to the tightness in his chest when he thought of Rebecca Lawson lying pale and still in the doctor's wagon. As the community rallied to fight the remaining flames, Flynn mounted Samson and turned toward town, toward the doctor's office where Rebecca fought for breath. He didn't understand the fierce protectiveness that had taken hold of him. They were practically strangers. After all, but he knew with absolute certainty that if Jeremiah Delaney had indeed trapped her in that barn and set it ablaze, there would be a reckoning. And Flynn McAllister would be the one to deliver it. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness for what seemed like an eternity. Fragmented images flashed through her mind, flames reaching for her, smoke choking her lungs, the terrifying crack of timber giving way beneath her. And then, cutting through the nightmare, the memory of strong arms around her, a gruff voice promising safety, and the sensation of flying through smoke and fire. When she finally opened her eyes fully, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar curtains. Her throat felt as though she'd swallowed broken glass, and each breath brought a sharp pain to her chest. Disoriented, she tried to sit up, only to fall back with a weak gasp. "Easy now, Miss Lawson," came a gentle voice. "You've had quite an ordeal." Rebecca turned her head to see Doc Henderson approaching her bedside, his kind face creased with concern. "The barn," she whispered, the words barely audible through her damaged throat. "Burned to the ground, I'm afraid," the doctor confirmed, helping her sip water from a glass. The cool liquid was both relief and agony on her raw throat. "But you're safe now, thanks to Flynn McAllister's heroics. Man rode straight into that inferno to fetch you out. Flynn McAllister." The name conjured a vague image of a tall, broad-shouldered man with serious eyes and a quiet demeanor. Rebecca had seen him around town occasionally since her arrival, though they'd exchanged no more than polite greetings. He owned a small ranch outside of town, she recalled Ellen Murphy telling her, and had once been a Texas Ranger. A man who kept to himself with a reputation for fairness and unwavering integrity. "He saved my life," Rebecca murmured, the enormity of it washing over her. "That he did," Doc Henderson agreed, checking her pulse. "And nearly got himself killed in the process. His hands were burned something fierce from climbing that ladder, but he refused proper treatment until I assured him you'd pull through." The doctor smiled slightly. "Been sitting outside my office most of the night, in fact." Rebecca's eyes widened at this information. "He's here." Doc Henderson nodded. "Sheriff Taylor's with him now, waiting to speak with you if you're up to it. They need to know what happened, Miss Lawson, how you came to be in that barn." The memories came rushing back. Jeremiah Delaney's unwanted advances, being locked in the barn, the first terrifying sight of flames. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly against the assault of fear the recollection brought, then nodded. "I'll speak with them." The doctor studied her face for a moment, then patted her hand. "I'll send them in, but only for a few minutes. You need rest to recover from the smoke damage to your lungs." He left the room, and moments later, Sheriff Taylor entered, followed by Flynn McAllister. Rebecca's eyes immediately went to the latter, tall and imposing in the small room, his hands wrapped in white bandages, his face bearing the reddened marks of heat exposure. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around him. "Miss Lawson," the sheriff began, removing his hat. "Mighty relieved to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been dragged behind a stagecoach," she admitted, her voice rough, "but grateful to be alive." Her eyes shifted to Flynn. "Thanks to Mr. McAllister." Flynn inclined his head slightly, his expression grave. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, madam. Nonetheless, I owe you my life," Rebecca insisted, holding his gaze. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection she couldn't quite define. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Miss Lawson, I hate to trouble you when you're recovering, but we need to understand what happened last night. How did you come to be in the barn when the fire started?" Rebecca took as deep a breath as her injured lungs would allow, then recounted the events leading up to her imprisonment in the barn. As she described Jeremiah Delaney's threatening behavior and how he had locked her inside, she noticed Flynn's expression darkening, his bandaged hands clenching into fists at his sides. "And the fire?" Sheriff Taylor asked when she had finished. "Did you see how it started?" Rebecca shook her head. "I was in the loft, searching for a way out. The smoke came first, then I saw flames near the main door. I don't know if it was deliberately set or an accident." The sheriff nodded, making notes in a small book. "Delaney and his boys cleared out right after the fire was discovered. No one's seen them since. That doesn't look like the behavior of innocent men." "You'll find them?" Rebecca asked, a tremor entering her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. The thought of Delaney returning, of facing him again, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with her injuries. "Count on it," Flynn spoke up, his deep voice resonating with quiet intensity. "They won't get away with this, Miss Lawson." Something in his tone made Rebecca believe him implicitly. This was not a man who made promises lightly. "We'll keep a deputy near the doctor's office until we have Delaney in custody," the sheriff assured her. "You just focus on getting well, Miss Lawson." "Thank you," Rebecca managed, fatigue suddenly overwhelming her. The effort of talking, of reliving the previous night's terror, had drained what little strength she had. Doc Henderson reappeared at the doorway. "That's enough for now, gentlemen. My patient needs rest." The sheriff nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "We'll talk again when you're stronger, Miss Lawson. Rest easy knowing you're safe now." As the sheriff turned to leave, Flynn lingered a moment longer. "Miss Lawson," he said quietly, "is there anything you need, anything I can do for you?" The simple question, offered with such genuine concern, touched Rebecca deeply. "You've done more than enough already, Mr. McAllister. I can never repay you." A slight smile softened his weathered features. "No repayment necessary, madam. Just get well." With that, he followed the sheriff out, leaving Rebecca to sink back against her pillows. As exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, her mind filled with the image of Flynn McAllister's face, the strength in his jaw, the warmth hidden in his serious eyes, and the gentle way he had spoken to her despite his imposing presence. Her last conscious thought before drifting off was a curious one. She hoped she would see him again. The next week passed in a haze of recovery for Rebecca. Her lungs gradually healed, though Doc Henderson warned it might be some time before she could draw a full breath without pain. The town rallied around her women, brought food, and offered to help with her lessons once she was strong enough to return to teaching, while men stopped by the doctor's office with news and well wishes. But it was Flynn McAllister's daily visits that became the anchors of her days. He never stayed long, seeming almost embarrassed by his own presence, but he faithfully appeared each afternoon, bringing small gifts that showed thoughtful consideration. Wild flowers gathered from the prairie, a book of poetry he'd ridden all the way to the next town to purchase, fresh eggs from his own hens. They talked during these visits, cautiously at first, then with growing ease as the days passed. Rebecca learned that Flynn had come west after the war, unable to settle back into civilian life in his native Virginia after the horrors he'd witnessed on the battlefield. He joined the Texas Rangers for a time, then drifted further west, eventually purchasing a small ranch outside Willow Creek 2 years prior. "It's not much," he told her on the 5th day of her recovery, sitting somewhat awkwardly in the chair beside her bed. "Just 100 acres, a small herd of cattle, and a cabin that leaks when it rains. But it's mine, free and clear." There was pride in his voice when he spoke of his land, and Rebecca found herself wanting to see this place that had given him such evident satisfaction. "It sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. "To build something of your own from nothing that takes courage and perseverance." Flynn looked slightly taken aback by her understanding, as if he'd expected criticism rather than appreciation from an educated Eastern woman. "Most ladies would find it primitive," he said cautiously. "No fancy parlors or modern conveniences." Rebecca smiled, thinking of her own small teacher's cabin. "I've discovered that comfort isn't always found in fine furnishings, Mr. McAllister. Sometimes it's in the satisfaction of independence, of making your own way." A look of surprise, followed by something warmer, crossed Flynn's face. "You understand that, then?" It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway. "I came west for many of the same reasons, I think. To build something of my own, to test my own strength." In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits beneath their outwardly different lives. Flynn leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "And have you found it, the strength you were looking for?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I was beginning to before the fire. Now." She trailed off, thinking of how Jeremiah Delaney's actions had shaken her newfound confidence. Flynn's bandaged hand moved as if to reach for hers, then stopped, retreating to his knee. "What Delaney did doesn't reflect on your strength, Miss Lawson. Surviving it does." His words touched her deeply, addressing the very doubts that had plagued her during recovery. Before she could respond, however, the door opened to admit Sheriff Taylor, his expression grim. "McAllister," he nodded to Flynn, then turned to Rebecca. "Miss Lawson, how are you faring today?" "Much improved, Sheriff, thank you," Rebecca replied, noting the tension that had entered the room with the lawman. "Do you have news?" The sheriff glanced at Flynn, then back to her. "We tracked Delaney and his men to a hideout in the Superstition Mountains, sent word to the territorial marshal for assistance bringing them in." "When?" Flynn asked, his voice taut. "Marshal should arrive within the week. We'll move on them then." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Flynn. "And I expect you to let us handle this officially, McAllister. No lone wolf justice." Flynn's jaw tightened visibly, but he gave a short nod. "As long as justice is served, Sheriff." The lawman seemed satisfied with this response and turned back to Rebecca. Doc Henderson says you'll be able to return to your cabin tomorrow. I'll have Deputy Clark stay nearby until Delaney's in custody. Thank you, Sheriff, Rebecca said, though the thought of returning to her isolated cabin brought a flutter of anxiety to her chest. The deputy was young and inexperienced. What if Delaney returned with his men before the marshal arrived? After the sheriff departed, Flynn remained silent for several long moments, his expression troubled. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. Miss Lawson, I don't like the idea of you returning to your cabin with just the deputy for protection. Delaney's a dangerous man, and if he learns the law is closing in on him, he might try to eliminate the only witness who can testify against him. Rebecca had considered this possibility herself, though she tried to dismiss it as irrational fear. Hearing Flynn voice the same concern sent a chill through her. What alternative is there? I can't impose on the doctor indefinitely. Flynn hesitated, seeming to wage some internal debate, then straightened his shoulders decisively. My ranch house has a spare room. It's simple accommodations, but it's 10 miles out of town, unknown to Delaney and his men. You'd be safe there until they're captured. Rebecca's eyes widened at the suggestion. A single woman staying at a bachelor's ranch. The impropriety would scandalize the town. Flynn, seeing her reaction, quickly added, Mrs. Abernathy from town comes out 3 times a week to help with cooking and laundry. She could stay over while you're there. Your reputation would be protected, and more importantly, so would your life. The earnestness in his eyes told Rebecca he was thinking solely of her safety, with no ulterior motives. Still, she hesitated, weighing propriety against security. The school board might object. They're very particular about the moral standing of their teacher. Better a living teacher with gossip attached to her name than a dead one with an unblemished reputation, Flynn said bluntly. Besides, anyone who knows me understands I wouldn't suggest this if I didn't believe the danger was real. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. There was something undeniably trustworthy about Flynn McAllister, a steadiness that invited confidence. And the thought of being somewhere truly safe, somewhere Delaney couldn't find her, was powerfully appealing. All right, she decided, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. I accept your offer, Mr. McAllister, but only until the marshal has Delaney in custody. Relief washed over Flynn's features. We'll leave at first light tomorrow. I'll speak with Doc Henderson and make the arrangements. As he rose to leave, Rebecca called after him. Mr. McAllister. When he turned back, she continued, Thank you, not just for the refuge, but for understanding the danger when others might dismiss my fears. Flynn's expression softened. Some men mistake kindness for weakness, Miss Lawson. I've never made that error. Rest now. Tomorrow will be a long day. After he left, Rebecca sank back against her pillows, wondering at the turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a proper Philadelphia schoolteacher with predictable days and conventional concerns. Now she was preparing to seek refuge at the ranch of a former Texas Ranger, hiding from a man who had tried to kill her. Strangely, despite the danger and uncertainty, she felt more alive than she had in years. And at the center of this new awareness was Flynn McAllister, a man who had already saved her life once and was now offering to protect it again. A man who, despite his reticence and formal manner, was beginning to occupy an increasingly significant place in her thoughts. Dawn was just breaking over the eastern horizon when Flynn arrived at the doctor's office the next morning, driving a sturdy wagon rather than riding Samson. Mrs. Abernathy, a stout, no-nonsense widow in her 50s, sat beside him on the wagon seat, her expression making it clear she considered herself the guardian of propriety for this expedition. Rebecca was ready, dressed in her simplest skirt and blouse, with her few belongings packed in the small trunk she'd brought from Philadelphia. Doc Henderson helped her to the wagon, his final instructions delivered with stern medical authority. Rest, Miss Lawson. No strenuous activity for at least another week. Your lungs need time to heal properly. I'll make sure she follows your orders, Doc, Mrs. Abernathy assured him, helping Rebecca onto the wagon seat between herself and Flynn. I've nursed 6 children through everything from measles to broken bones. I know how to make stubborn patients behave. Flynn's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile as he flicked the reins, setting the horses in motion. They traveled through town just as shopkeepers were opening their doors, drawing curious glances. Rebecca felt a momentary pang at what must look like her fleeing town with Flynn McAllister, but she straightened her shoulders resolutely. Her safety mattered more than gossip. Once they left the town behind, the journey became pleasant despite Rebecca's lingering weakness. The spring morning was crisp and clear, with wildflowers dotting the prairie in vibrant splashes of color. Flynn pointed out landmarks as they traveled a distinctive rock formation, a creek that ran year-round even in the driest summers, a distant line of cottonwoods that marked the boundary of his property. Mrs. Abernathy kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling Rebecca in on the history of the area and its inhabitants. It was from her that Rebecca learned more about Flynn's reputation in the region. "Fairest man you'll ever meet," the widow said matter-of-factly, pitching her voice just low enough that Flynn, concentrating on a rough patch of road, wouldn't overhear. When the Clancy boys tried to rustle his cattle last year, he tracked them down and brought them back to face the law instead of shooting them outright, which many would have done. And when Widow Jenkins couldn't pay her taxes after her husband died, it was Flynn who anonymously provided the money to the tax collector. Rebecca glanced at the man beside her with new interest. "He doesn't seem comfortable with gratitude," she observed quietly. Mrs. Abernathy chuckled. "Man's been alone too long. Wouldn't know how to accept a kind word if it came with written instructions, but he's got a good heart beneath all that gruffness." As they crested a gentle rise, Flynn's ranch came into view in the valley below. It was indeed modest, a sturdy log cabin with a covered porch, a barn and corral, and several outbuildings scattered nearby. A small creek wound through the property, and cattle grazed on the grassy slopes beyond. It wasn't grand or impressive, but there was a peaceful harmony to the scene that Rebecca found immediately appealing. "It's lovely," she said sincerely, and was rewarded with a quick, pleased glance from Flynn. "It's not much compared to Philadelphia, I expect," he replied, guiding the wagon down the slope toward the cabin. "Philadelphia had many fine buildings," Rebecca acknowledged, "but not one of them belonged to me, nor did they offer this kind of peace." She gestured to the expansive sky above them, the rolling land with its promise of independence and possibility. "There's a different kind of beauty here." Flynn studied her for a moment, as if reassessing his understanding of her. "Yes," he finally said, "there is." The cabin proved to be simple but comfortable inside, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace. 2 doors led off this central space, one to Flynn's bedroom and the other to the spare room that would be Rebecca's during her stay. It was small, containing just a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a chair, but it was clean and bright, with calico curtains at the window. Mrs. Abernathy made the curtains, Flynn explained somewhat self-consciously when he showed Rebecca the room. Said the place needed a woman's touch, at least in small doses. "They're charming," Rebecca assured him, setting her small carpetbag on the bed. Her trunk remained in the wagon, too heavy for her to manage in her weakened state. "I'll bring your trunk in once you've had a chance to rest," Flynn said, as if reading her thoughts. "Doc Henderson was clear that you shouldn't overexert yourself." "I'm not completely helpless, Mr. McAllister," Rebecca protested, though in truth she was already feeling fatigued from the journey. "Flynn," he corrected her quietly. "If you're staying in my home, seems only right you should use my given name." The simple request warmed Rebecca unexpectedly. "Then you must call me Rebecca," she replied, adding with a small smile, "at least when we're not in town. I'm not sure the school board would approve of such informality between us." A spark of something amusement, pleasure, flashed in Flynn's eyes. "Rebecca, then. And now I'll leave you to rest while Mrs. Abernathy prepares lunch. The journey has tired you more than you're willing to admit." It was true, though Rebecca was reluctant to acknowledge her weakness. Still, she nodded agreement and watched as Flynn left, closing the door quietly behind him. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she looked around the simple room that would be her sanctuary for the coming days. Despite the circumstances that had brought her here, a curious sense of rightness settled over her. For the first time since the fire, perhaps even since arriving in Arizona, she felt truly safe. The next few days established a peaceful routine at the ranch. True to Doc Henderson's orders, Rebecca spent much of her time resting, though she insisted on helping with small tasks that wouldn't strain her healing lungs. She discovered that Flynn was an early riser, often completing several hours of ranch work before breakfast. Mrs. Abernathy prepared their meals and kept the cabin in order, her motherly presence both a comfort to Rebecca and a shield against any potential gossip about the arrangement. During the evenings, after Mrs. Abernathy had retired to the small room off the kitchen that served as her quarters when she stayed over, Rebecca and Flynn would sit before the fireplace, talking quietly. These conversations, starting tentatively but growing more comfortable with each passing day, revealed layers to Flynn that surprised and intrigued Rebecca. He was well-read despite his lack of formal education, with a particular fondness for history and poetry. He spoke thoughtfully about his experiences during and after the war, sharing insights that revealed a deeply reflective mind beneath his taciturn exterior. And he truly listened, when Rebecca talked about her own life, her dreams for her pupils, and her hopes for her future in the West. On the fourth evening of her stay, as they sat companionably before the fire, Flynn asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Do you regret coming west? After what happened, I mean." Rebecca considered the question carefully, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "No," she said finally. "I came seeking independence and purpose. The fact that there's danger doesn't invalidate those goals." She looked up at him, seated in the chair opposite hers. "Do you regret staying out here alone, knowing there are men like Delaney in the territory?" Flynn's expression grew thoughtful. "There are men like Delaney everywhere. At least out here a person can see them coming most of the time." He paused, adding quietly, "But I'll admit, there are moments when the solitude weighs heavier than others." The admission, coming from this self-contained man, felt significant. Rebecca found herself wondering what kind of woman Flynn McAllister might have imagined sharing his life with before solitude became his chosen companion. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door broke the moment. Flynn was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver he kept nearby even in his own home. "Stay back," he told Rebecca quietly, moving toward the door with the fluid caution of a man accustomed to danger. "Who's there?" he called. "Deputy Clerk, Mr. McAllister." "Sheriff sent me with news." Flynn relaxed slightly but still opened the door with care, positioning himself to shield Rebecca from view. The young deputy stood on the porch, his horse visible in the yard behind him. "Evening, Deputy," Flynn greeted him, stepping aside to allow the man entry. "What brings you out this way after dark?" Deputy Clark removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Rebecca when he spotted her by the fire. "Evening, Miss Lawson. Glad to see you recovering." Turning back to Flynn, he continued, "Sheriff asked me to let you know the marshal arrived this afternoon. They're planning to ride out at first light tomorrow to apprehend Delaney and his men." A visible tension left Flynn's shoulders at this news. "Good. The sooner that snake is behind bars, the better. Sheriff thought you'd want to know, especially considering." The deputy glanced toward Rebecca. "Well, considering your current guest." "I appreciate the information," Flynn said. "Will you join us for coffee before you ride back?" The deputy shook his head. "Thank you, sir, but I should get back. Sheriff wants all hands ready for tomorrow's operation." After the deputy departed, Rebecca and Flynn returned to their seats by the fire, the atmosphere between them subtly altered by the news. "It will be over soon," Rebecca said, trying to sound relieved, though a strange reluctance had crept into her heart. Once Delaney was captured, there would be no reason for her to remain at Flynn's ranch. She would return to her cabin, to her teaching, and Flynn would go back to his solitary life. The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss. Flynn was watching her closely, perhaps sensing her conflicted emotions. Yes, he agreed. You'll be able to return to town safely in a day or two. Was it her imagination, or did he sound as ambivalent about this prospect as she felt? Rebecca searched for something to say, some way to express the complicated feelings swirling within her, but the words wouldn't come. It's getting late, Flynn said finally, rising from his chair. And tomorrow will bring news one way or another. We should both get some rest. Rebecca nodded, standing as well. As she moved toward her room, Flynn spoke again, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. Rebecca. She turned back to find him watching her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. Yes. For a moment, it seemed he might say something significant, something that would acknowledge the growing connection between them. But then he shook his head slightly. Sleep well, he said simply. You too, Flynn, she replied, carrying with her to her room the image of his face in that unguarded moment and the possibilities it suggested. Morning brought a steady rain that turned the yard to mud and cast a gray pall over the landscape. Rebecca woke to the sound of it pattering on the roof, a soothing rhythm that tempted her to linger in bed. But the knowledge that today might bring resolution to the Delaney situation, and with it, an end to her stay at the ranch, spurred her to rise and dress quickly. She found Mrs. Abernathy already at work in the kitchen, kneading dough for biscuits while coffee percolated on the stove. Flynn was nowhere to be seen. Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy, Rebecca greeted the older woman. Has Flynn already gone out? The widow nodded, dusting flour from her hands. Left before dawn, despite the rain, said he had to check on a heifer that's close to calving. She gave Rebecca an appraising look. You're looking stronger today, colors coming back to your cheeks. I feel much better, Rebecca admitted, pouring herself a cup of coffee. It was true the persistent ache in her chest had finally subsided, and she could take a deep breath without pain for the first time since the fire. Doc Henderson was right about rest being the best medicine. Mrs. Abernathy harumphed softly, that and being away from worry for a few days. Safety does wonders for healing. She pressed the dough into a pan and slid it into the oven before continuing. Flynn says you'll likely be able to return to town tomorrow, assuming the marshal brings in Delaney today. Rebecca nodded, trying to muster enthusiasm for the prospect. Yes, I should be able to resume teaching next week. My students have missed enough lessons already. The older woman studied her shrewdly. And will you be glad to leave this place? The directness of the question caught Rebecca off guard. I've appreciated the sanctuary, she replied carefully. Both of you have been incredibly kind. Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened. He'll miss having you here, you know. I haven't seen Flynn so animated in conversation since I've known him. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication. We've become friends, I think, she said, striving for a neutral tone. I value his company as well. Friends, Mrs. Abernathy repeated, a knowing look in her eyes. Well, friendship is a fine foundation for other things when the time is right. Before Rebecca could formulate a response to this rather pointed observation, the door opened and Flynn entered, bringing with him the scent of rain and damp earth. His hat and coat were soaked, but his expression was satisfied. Healthy calf born about an hour ago, he announced, removing his wet outer garments and hanging them by the door. Fine little heifer with a white star on her forehead. That's wonderful news, Rebecca said, genuinely pleased by the simple joy of new life on the ranch. Is the mother doing well? Flynn nodded, seeming touched by her interest. Just fine. Experienced cow knows what she's doing. He accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Abernathy handed him, warming his hands around it. Any word from town? The widow shook her head. Not yet, but with this rain they might delay going after Delaney. Flynn's expression darkened. Let's hope not. The sooner he's behind bars, the better for everyone. The day passed slowly, the continuous rainfall keeping them mostly confined to the cabin. Rebecca found herself acutely aware of Flynn's presence as they moved around the small space, the brush of his arm as he reached past her for a book, the warmth of his hand when it briefly touched hers while passing a plate at lunch. Each small contact seemed charged with unspoken meaning, heightening her awareness of him not just as her protector, but as a man whose quiet strength and integrity had come to mean a great deal to her, by late afternoon, with no word from town, a restlessness had settled over them all. Mrs. Abernathy busied herself with dinner preparations, while Flynn cleaned his revolver at the table, his movements methodical and practiced. Rebecca stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass and trying to sort through her conflicting emotions. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that the sound of approaching hoofbeats didn't register until Flynn was suddenly beside her, his body tense. "Someone's coming," he said, moving to retrieve his newly cleaned revolver from the table. "Stay away from the windows." Rebecca stepped back as Flynn positioned himself near the door, weapon at the ready. Mrs. Abernathy calmly wiped her hands on her apron and moved to stand near Rebecca, her solid presence reassuring. The hoofbeats slowed as they approached the cabin, and then a voice called out, "McAllister." "It's Sheriff Taylor." Flynn relaxed visibly, but didn't lower his gun completely until he'd opened the door and confirmed the sheriff's identity. Rain poured down around the lawman as he dismounted and hurried to the porch, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Come in, Sheriff," Flynn invited, stepping back to allow the man entry. "You look half drowned." Sheriff Taylor removed his hat, shaking water from it before entering the cabin. His expression was grim, immediately putting Rebecca on alert. This wasn't the face of a man bringing news of a successful capture. "What happened?" Flynn asked, evidently reaching the same conclusion. The sheriff accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Abernathy offered, taking a fortifying sip before answering. "Delaney was gone when we got to the hideout. Place was cleared out like they'd left in a hurry." Rebecca felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Gone? But how did they know you were coming?" Sheriff Taylor sighed heavily. "Someone tipped them off, don't know who yet, but I aim to find out." He looked directly at Rebecca, his expression grave. "The problem is, we found something at the hideout that suggests Delaney hasn't finished with you, Miss Lawson." Flynn moved closer to Rebecca, as if physically positioning himself between her and potential danger. "What did you find?" "A map of the town with the schoolhouse marked," the sheriff replied, "and some scribblings that made it clear he blames Miss Lawson for having to run. Man's planning revenge." The room seemed to tilt around Rebecca. The nightmare wasn't over, it was only beginning. "He'll come for me," she whispered, the reality of it settling like ice in her veins. Flynn's hand came to rest on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Not if we stop him first." He turned to the sheriff. "What's your plan?" Sheriff Taylor set down his cup. "Marshall's organizing a larger posse, bringing in men from neighboring counties. We'll find him, but it might take time, and meanwhile." He looked at Rebecca. "You can't go back to town, Miss Lawson, not yet. It's the first place he'll look." "She'll stay here," Flynn said immediately, his tone brooking no argument. "Delaney doesn't know about my ranch, and even if he did, he'd have to get through me to reach her." The certainty in his voice, the unwavering commitment to her protection, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. In the midst of renewed fear, Flynn's presence was her anchor. "I appreciate that, McAllister," the sheriff said. "I'll leave Deputy Williams here as additional protection, just in case, and I'll send word as soon as we have Delaney in custody." After the sheriff departed, leaving the promised deputy stationed in the barn where he could watch the approach to the ranch, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Rebecca sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to process this new development. "I'm putting you all in danger by staying here," she said finally, looking up at Flynn, who stood near the fireplace, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps I should go somewhere else, to Tucson or Phoenix, somewhere Delaney wouldn't think to look, and live in fear, always looking over your shoulder." Flynn shook his head. "That's no life, Rebecca. Besides, traveling alone would make you more vulnerable, not less." Mrs. Abernathy, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the sheriff's visit, spoke up firmly. "Flynn's right. You're safest right here, with people who care about protecting you." The simple truth in those words, that these people cared for her, that she wasn't alone in this fight, brought a rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm Rebecca's carefully maintained composure. "I don't know how to thank you both," she managed, her voice unsteady. Flynn crossed to her then, kneeling beside her chair so that his eyes were level with hers. "You don't need to thank us, just promise me you'll stay strong." His gaze held hers, intense and sincere. "We'll get through this, Rebecca, together." In that moment, looking into Flynn's eyes, Rebecca believed him. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she knew with absolute clarity that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And somehow, that made all the difference. The next 3 days passed in a state of heightened vigilance at the ranch. Flynn rarely left Rebecca's side, and when ranch duties called him away, Deputy Williams stayed within earshot of the cabin. The rain continued intermittently, turning the surrounding prairie into a sea of mud that would at least make any approach to the ranch difficult to conceal. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as Rebecca sat on the porch mending one of Flynn's shirts while he worked on repairing a saddle nearby, she found herself reflecting on how quickly she had adapted to life at the ranch. There was a rhythm to the days here, a purpose to each task that she found deeply satisfying. Even more, there was Flynn's steady presence, increasingly essential to her sense of well-being in ways that went far beyond physical protection. "You're very quiet," Flynn observed, glancing up from his work. "Are you feeling all right?" Rebecca smiled, touched by his concern. "I'm fine, just thinking about how different this is from what I expected when I came west." She set her mending aside, looking out at the rain-washed landscape. "I thought I was coming to teach children and build a respectable life as the town's schoolmistress. Instead, I'm hiding on a ranch from a man who wants to kill me." Flynn's hands stilled on the leather he was working. "Do you regret it, coming west?" It was the second time he had asked this question, and Rebecca considered it as carefully as before. "No," she said finally, with more certainty than she'd felt the first time. "Despite everything, I don't regret it. If I hadn't come, I wouldn't have met." She stopped, suddenly self-conscious. Flynn looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Wouldn't have met who?" Rebecca gathered her courage. They had been dancing around the growing connection between them for days, neither quite willing to acknowledge what was becoming increasingly obvious. "Perhaps it was time for honesty. You," she said simply. "I wouldn't have met you, Flynn, and that would have been a great loss, I think." The raw emotion that crossed his face made her heart race. He set aside the saddle and moved to sit beside her on the porch step, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the damp chill of the day. "Rebecca," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I've been alone a long time, convinced myself it was better that way, safer. But these past days with you here—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It's like finding something I didn't know I was missing until it was right in front of me." Rebecca's heart swelled at this declaration, so honest in its simplicity. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "When I think about going back to town, to my empty cabin and solitary life, it feels wrong somehow. As if I'd be leaving part of myself behind." Flynn reached for her hand then, his calloused fingers enveloping hers with gentle strength. "You don't have to leave," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not ever, if you don't want to." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, momentous and irrevocable. Rebecca looked at their joined hands, then up into Flynn's eyes, finding in them a warmth and hope that mirrored her own feelings. "Flynn, are you asking?" A shout from the direction of the barn interrupted her, followed by the sharp crack of a gunshot. Flynn was on his feet instantly, pulling Rebecca up and pushing her toward the cabin door. "Get inside," he ordered, drawing his revolver. "Bar the door behind me." "What about you?" Rebecca protested, clutching at his arm. "I need to check on Williams," Flynn replied grimly. "Go, Rebecca, now." The urgency in his voice compelled her obedience. Rebecca hurried into the cabin, where Mrs. Abernathy already stood with a shotgun in her capable hands. "Bar the door after Flynn," the widow instructed calmly. "Then take position at the back window. If anyone tries to come in that way, call out." Rebecca did as she was told, her heart pounding with fear not for herself, but for Flynn, who had disappeared into the rain-soaked yard. Moving with the cautious grace of a man accustomed to danger, through the front window, she could see nothing but rain and gathering dusk. The shot had come from the direction of the barn, but visibility was too poor to make out what might be happening there. Long minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Then, suddenly, multiple gunshots shattered the quiet 3, 4, 5 in rapid succession. Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a cry of alarm. Mrs. Abernathy moved to stand beside her, shotgun at the ready, her weathered face set in determined lines. "Flynn knows what he's doing," the older woman said steadily. "Have faith in that." Rebecca nodded, clinging to this reassurance even as her mind conjured terrifying images of Flynn lying injured or worse in the mud outside. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the sound of running footsteps on the porch. "Rebecca, Mrs. Abernathy, it's me, open up." Flynn's voice, urgent but blessedly alive. Rebecca rushed to unbar the door, flinging it open to reveal Flynn supporting a bloodied Deputy Williams. She moved quickly to help, taking some of the young man's weight as they maneuvered him inside and onto Flynn's bed. "Delaney, Mrs. Abernathy asked tersely, setting aside the shotgun to examine the deputy's wound, a gunshot to the upper arm that was bleeding profusely but didn't appear life-threatening. Flynn nodded grimly, retrieving clean cloths for the widow to use as bandages. Him and 2 of his men. They shot Williams when he challenged them, then tried to circle around to the cabin. I managed to wing one of them and they retreated toward the creek. He turned to Rebecca, his eyes intense. "They'll be back. We need to get you somewhere safer." "Where?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "If they found us here." "The line shack," Flynn decided, already moving to gather supplies. "It's a small cabin about 3 miles north up in the foothills. Used it during roundups before I built the main house. Hard to find if you don't know it's there." Mrs. Abernathy looked up from tending to the deputy. "I'll stay with Williams. You take Miss Lawson to the shack. Better hurry, those men won't stay gone long, especially with one of them injured." Flynn hesitated. "I don't like leaving you alone with a wounded man, Mrs. Abernathy." The widow fixed him with a stern look. "I raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands, Flynn McAllister. I can handle a flesh wound and a few outlaws. Now go before it's fully dark." There was no arguing with her tone. Flynn nodded once, then turned to Rebecca. "Pack only what you absolutely need. We'll be traveling fast and light." Within minutes, they were ready, Rebecca with a small bundle of necessities, Flynn with his rifle, ammunition, and provisions enough for several days. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground was sodden, and twilight was rapidly giving way to night. Flynn led Rebecca to the back of the barn where Samson waited, already saddled. "We'll ride double," he explained, helping her mount before swinging up behind her. "Hold tight to the saddle horn. I need both hands to manage Samson and keep watch." Rebecca nodded, settling into the unfamiliar position with Flynn's solid warmth at her back. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a circle of protection that, despite the danger, made her feel strangely safe. They set off at a careful pace, avoiding the main trail and instead cutting across the open range toward the distant foothills. Flynn kept them moving through stands of trees and along shallow draws where they would be less visible against the darkening landscape. Rebecca could feel the tension in his body as he constantly scanned their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when a shout rang out behind them, followed by the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Flynn urged Samson into a gallop, his arm tightening around Rebecca's waist to keep her secure. "They've picked up our trail," he said grimly, guiding the horse into a dense copse of cottonwoods. "Hold on tight, it's going to be a rough ride from here." Rebecca gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination as Samson surged forward, powerful muscles bunching beneath them. The sound of pursuit grew louder, and then a shot rang out, the bullet whistling past them to embed itself in a tree trunk ahead. Flynn swore under his breath, urging Samson to greater speed. They burst from the trees onto open ground, the foothills now visible as darker masses against the night sky. Behind them, Rebecca could make out 3 riders gaining ground, their shapes indistinct in the gloom. "We can't outrun them with double weight," Flynn said tersely. We need to make a stand. He scanned the terrain ahead, then made a decision. There's a rock outcropping just ahead. Good defensive position, we'll make for that. Rebecca's heart pounded with fear and a strange exhilaration. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, she felt more vividly alive than ever before, acutely aware of Flynn's strength behind her, of the power of the horse beneath them, of the vast wild country through which they fled. The outcropping appeared as Flynn had described, a jumble of massive boulders rising from the prairie floor, offering both cover and a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Flynn guided Samson into a narrow gap between two of the largest rocks, then dismounted swiftly, helping Rebecca down before securing the horse. "Stay low," he instructed, positioning her behind the shelter of a boulder. He handed her his revolver. "Do you know how to use this?" Rebecca nodded. Her father had insisted she learn basic firearms handling before traveling west, considering it an essential skill for a woman living on the frontier. Yes, but Flynn, he cut her off with a quick, fierce kiss that left her breathless. "I'm coming back," he promised against her lips. "Whatever happens, remember that." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving silently through the rocks with his rifle in hand, positioning himself where he could command a view of the approaching riders. Rebecca pressed her back against the cool stone, the revolver heavy in her hands, and waited. The riders slowed as they approached the outcropping, clearly wary of riding into an ambush. Rebecca heard them conferring in low voices, then the unmistakable sound of boots on rock as they dismounted and began to advance on foot. "McAllister." A harsh voice called out Delaney, Rebecca realized with a chill. "We know you're in there. Send out the schoolmarm and maybe we'll let you live." Flynn made no reply, but Rebecca could sense him tensing, preparing. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional clink of a boot against stone as the men drew closer. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the edge of Rebecca's vision, a man creeping around the boulder that sheltered her, his gun drawn. Without conscious thought, Rebecca raised the revolver and fired. The report was deafening in the confined space, and the man cried out, staggering backward with a wound to his shoulder. The shot triggered an eruption of gunfire. Flynn's rifle cracked, and one of the attackers fell with a scream. Return fire ricocheted off the rocks around them as Delaney and his remaining man sought cover. "Rebecca," Flynn called, "are you hit?" "No," she called back, her voice steadier than she would have expected. "I'm all right." Another exchange of shots, and then an eerie silence fell. Rebecca strained to hear any movement, any indication of what was happening. The minutes stretched, tension building until she thought she might scream from the pressure of it. Then, from much closer than she'd expected, Delaney's voice, "Pretty shooting for a schoolmarm, but it won't save you." He was directly on the other side of her boulder. Rebecca raised the revolver, her hands surprisingly steady, and waited. When Delaney's face appeared around the edge of the rock, she was ready. "Drop your gun," she ordered, the revolver aimed squarely at his chest. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a sneer. "You won't shoot me, schoolmarm, not in cold blood. You ain't got the stomach for it." "Try me," Rebecca replied, her voice cold. "You locked me in a burning barn. You tried to kill me once. I won't give you a second chance." Something in her tone must have convinced him she was serious. Delaney's expression faltered and his gun hand wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Flynn appeared behind him, the barrel of his rifle pressed to Delaney's back. "Drop it," Flynn growled, "or I'll put a hole through your spine." Delaney's gun clattered to the ground. Flynn kicked it away, then smoothly disarmed the man, binding his wrists with a length of rawhide from his pocket. "The others?" Rebecca asked, lowering the revolver with hands that had begun to tremble now that the immediate danger had passed. "One dead, one wounded and tied up with the horses," Flynn replied, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "Are you truly unharmed?" Rebecca nodded, a delayed reaction setting in as the reality of what had just occurred hit her fully. "I shot a man," she whispered, looking down at the revolver still clutched in her hand. Flynn moved to her side, gently taking the weapon and tucking it into his belt before drawing her into his arms. "You protected yourself," he corrected quietly. "You showed courage most men would envy." She leaned into his strength, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability now that the danger had passed. What happens now? Flynn's arms tightened around her. We take Delaney and his surviving man back to town to face justice, and then, he pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. And then we finish the conversation that was interrupted on my porch. Despite everything, the danger, the violence, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Rebecca found herself smiling up at him. I'd like that, she said softly. Flynn's answering smile transformed his face, erasing the hard lines of battle and revealing the man beneath the warrior. So would I, he replied, and in the simple words was a promise of something Rebecca had not dared to hope for when she first came west, not just independence and purpose, but a love equal to her own strength and courage. As dawn broke over the prairie the next morning, Rebecca sat beside Flynn on the porch of his ranch house, watching as Sheriff Taylor and his deputies prepared to transport Delaney and his surviving henchmen to the territorial prison. The night had been long, returning to the ranch, tending to Deputy Williams, providing statements to the sheriff who had arrived with reinforcements shortly after they returned with their prisoners. But now, with justice in motion and the immediate danger past, a sense of peace settled over the ranch. Mrs. Abernathy had tactfully made herself scarce, accompanying Deputy Williams to town where his wound could receive proper medical attention. For the first time since her arrival, Rebecca and Flynn were truly alone. The sheriff says I'll need to testify at Delaney's trial, Rebecca said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. But after that, there's nothing to prevent me from returning to my teaching position. Flynn nodded slowly, his eyes on the departing lawman rather than on her. You'll be safe now, free to build the life you came west for. There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that made Rebecca turn to study his profile. Yes, she agreed, I can return to my original plan, a respectable position, independence, a purpose of my own. She paused, then added quietly, but plans can change, can't they? When something unexpected comes along, that makes the original path seem incomplete. Now Flynn did look at her, hope dawning in his eyes. What are you saying, Rebecca? She took a deep breath, summoning her courage. After facing fire and gunfights, this should have been easier, but her heart still raced as if she were facing the greatest danger yet. I'm saying that before Delaney interrupted us yesterday, you were about to ask me something important, and I was about to say yes. Flynn's expression softened, the mask of careful restraint falling away to reveal raw emotion. You don't know what I was going to ask, he pointed out, though his voice had roughened with feeling. Don't I? Rebecca challenged gently. You said I didn't have to leave. Not ever if I didn't want to. Flynn took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I meant it, he said simply. But I need you to be certain, Rebecca, life out here isn't easy. It's not the respectable town position you came for. People might talk. Rebecca smiled, squeezing his hand. Let them. I've discovered something about myself since coming west, Flynn. I'm stronger than I knew, strong enough to follow my heart, even if it leads me off the path I expected to take. She looked out at the ranch, at the rolling land and open sky that had come to mean freedom to her. Besides, this feels right in a way teaching in town never quite did, as if I've found where I truly belong. Flynn's free hand came up to cup her cheek, turning her face back to his. With me? He asked, and beneath the simple question was a vulnerability that touched her deeply. With you, she confirmed softly, if that's what you're asking. The smile that transformed Flynn's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. It is, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Rebecca Lawson, will you stay? Will you make this ranch your home and me the happiest man in the territory? In answer, Rebecca leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that held all the promise of the future stretching before them, a future neither had imagined when fate and fire first brought them together, but one now filled with possibility and love. When they finally parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I never thought I'd find someone who understood this life, who could see beauty in its challenges, he murmured. And then you came along, a Philadelphia schoolteacher who shoots straight and faces down outlaws without flinching. Rebecca laughed softly. Not exactly the proper lady I was raised to be. Thank God for that, Flynn replied fervently, drawing her into his arms as the sun rose higher, bathing the ranch in golden light and the promise of all the days to come, days they would face together, with the strength they had discovered in each other. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the doorway of the ranch house, her home, now watching as Flynn worked with a young colt in the corral. The autumn sunlight glinted off the gold band on her left hand, still new enough that she sometimes caught herself admiring it with a sense of wonder. Their wedding had been a simple affair held on the ranch with the whole town in attendance. Even Mrs. Murphy, whose barn had been the unlikely starting point of their journey together, had declared it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed, a sentiment echoed by many who had seen Flynn carry Rebecca from the burning building that fateful night. Teaching had not been abandoned entirely. 3 times a week, the children from outlying ranches gathered at the McAllister place for lessons, their laughter now a familiar and welcome sound. Rebecca found she preferred this arrangement to the confines of the town schoolhouse. It allowed her to combine her love of education with her newfound passion for ranch life. And passion was not too strong a word for what she felt for this place, for the life she and Flynn were building together. There was a deep satisfaction in the rhythm of their days, in the shared work and shared rest, in watching the land respond to their care. But it was Flynn himself who remained the center of her world, her husband, her partner, her protector, who had taught her she was strong enough to protect herself as well. Each day brought new discoveries about him, new facets of the man she had married, and each discovery only deepened her love. As if sensing her thoughts, Flynn looked up from his work, his face breaking into the smile that never failed to quicken her heart. He secured the colt, then walked toward her, his stride purposeful and his eyes never leaving her face. "What are you thinking, standing there looking so contemplative?" he asked, pulling her into his arms once he reached her. Rebecca smiled up at him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I was thinking about the fire," she admitted. About how something that seemed like the end of everything turned out to be just the beginning. Flynn's expression grew serious. "I still have nightmares sometimes," he confessed, his hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Seeing that barn in flames, knowing you were inside. Afraid I wouldn't reach you in time." "But you did," Rebecca reminded him gently. "You rode through smoke and carried me out." She stood on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips. "My hero, whether you're comfortable with the title or not." Flynn's arms tightened around her. "I wasn't the only hero that night," he pointed out. "You fought for your life before I ever arrived, and later with Delaney." He shook his head admiringly. "You're quite a woman, Rebecca McAllister." "And you're quite a man, Flynn McAllister," she returned, leaning into his strength with a contentment that still amazed her. "Exactly the man I didn't know I was looking for when I came west." As Flynn lowered his head to capture her lips in a kiss that spoke of passion and promise, of a future built on the foundation of that fiery night, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had risked everything to save her, and in doing so, had saved himself as well. From flames and danger had come the greatest gift of all, a love strong enough to forge a life together on the wild frontier, where each day brought new challenges and new joys to the former schoolteacher and the rancher, who had found in each other exactly what they never knew they were missing.